I was sitting at my own dinner table when my daughter looked straight at me and said, "Pay the mortgage." Everyone laughed like it was harmless, like I was just a confused old woman who had lost track of her own life. But the truth was, that house had been paid off for years. In that moment, I realized something far worse than disrespect. I was being erased piece by piece in my own home. And what I did next changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a retired high school history teacher, and a widow. I have lived most of my life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the air is dry, the sunsets are slow and golden, and the houses seem to grow out of the earth itself. My home is one of those houses, built in the old adobe style, its walls thick and warm, holding decades of memories inside them. My husband and I did not buy this house. We built it. 30 years ago, we stood on an empty stretch of land with nothing but a sketch on paper and a belief that we could create something lasting. We chose every detail ourselves. The wooden beams across the ceiling were sanded by his hands. The garden out front was planted one stubborn afternoon under a relentless sun. Even now, I can still see him kneeling in the dirt, smiling as if the future was already secure. When he died, it was sudden. A heart attack that gave us no warning and no time to prepare. One moment, he was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and the next, the house felt impossibly large and silent. I remember walking from room to room in those first weeks, touching things as if they might still be warm from his presence, but everything had already cooled. The quiet that followed was not peaceful, it was heavy. Every creak of the floor sounded louder, every evening stretched longer than it should. I told myself I could handle it. After all, I had spent a lifetime being practical, being steady. But loneliness does not announce itself all at once. It settles slowly, like dust, until you realize you are breathing it in. My daughter Evelyn called me often during that time. She lived in Los Angeles with her husband Daniel, who worked in finance. She spoke with concern in her voice, asking if I was eating properly, if I was sleeping. A few weeks after the funeral, she suggested that they come stay with me for a while, just until things felt normal again. I agreed without hesitation. When they arrived, the house changed immediately. There was movement again, conversation, the sound of dishes and footsteps and doors opening and closing. For the first time since my husband passed, the silence retreated. I felt grateful. I told myself that this was what family was meant to do. Evelyn took over the kitchen at first, cooking meals I had not had the energy to prepare. Daniel was polite, always respectful, speaking in measured tones that made him seem dependable. In those early months, we sat together at the dining table every evening. We talked about small things, about the weather, about work, about nothing that truly mattered, and yet it felt like everything. Then gradually, things began to shift. They moved into the master bedroom, saying it made more sense for them to have the larger space. I did not argue. It seemed practical. Daniel suggested a few updates to the house, small changes at first, a new coffee maker, different lighting in the living room. Evelyn replaced some of the furniture, explaining that it would make the house feel more modern. I nodded along to everything. Eventually, I moved into the smaller room near the kitchen. It had once been used for storage, but they cleared it out for me. They said it would be cozier, easier to maintain. I told them it was fine. I told myself it was temporary. And perhaps that was the moment something truly changed. Not all at once, not in a way I could clearly point to, but standing in that smaller room, looking at walls that did not hold the same memories, I felt a quiet unease settle in my chest. I did not question it. I simply closed the door and told myself that everything was still as it should be. If you're still watching and starting to feel something is quietly off in this home, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to what begins to crack beneath the surface. Mornings in the house used to belong to me. I used to wake early, brew coffee, and sit by the window as the sun slowly warmed the adobe walls. Now, the mornings begin before I reach the kitchen, and by the time I step into the hallway, the rhythm of the house is already set by someone else. I hear Evelyn first, moving quickly, opening cabinets, closing them with a certainty that tells me she no longer feels like a guest. Daniel follows, quieter, but just as present, his footsteps measured, his voice low as he speaks into his phone. Their routines overlap with mine, yet somehow leave no space for me within them. I still make my coffee, but I no longer choose where things are kept. The mugs have been rearranged. The old tin of ground coffee I used for years has been replaced by something more expensive, something Daniel insists tastes better. I use it without comment. It is not just the kitchen. The living room has changed too. The chairs I once chose for comfort are gone, replaced by sleeker ones that look untouched. The photographs that used to line the shelves have been reduced, some placed in boxes I have not opened. When I asked about one of them, Evelyn said it was safer to store it away. I nodded. The changes never come all at once. They arrive quietly, each one reasonable on its own. A lamp moved here, a table replaced there. By the time I notice, the room no longer feels like mine, though I cannot say exactly when that happened. The first time I felt something shift inside me was over something small, the mail. Daniel began collecting it before I had the chance. At first, he said he was helping, making sure nothing important was missed. I appreciated that. But then I noticed that some envelopes were already open by the time they reached me. Bank statements, notices, documents that I had always handled myself. I told myself it was convenient. Still, a question lingered, quiet and persistent. One evening, Evelyn invited a few friends over. People I did not know well, though they greeted me kindly enough. I sat with them in the living room, listening more than speaking, as the conversation moved from work to travel to investments. It was a world I had never needed to understand deeply, and I was content to remain on the edges of it. At some point, someone asked Evelyn how things were going with the house. She laughed lightly and gestured toward me. I have been helping Mom with everything. She is not really great with finances anymore. The room responded with polite smiles, a few soft laughs, nothing loud, nothing cruel. But something in the air shifted, just enough for me to feel it. I smiled too. I even nodded, as if I agreed. Inside, though, something tightened. I had managed my household for decades. I had balanced budgets, paid bills, planned for retirement. I knew exactly where every dollar had gone. Yet in that moment, I felt as if that version of me had been quietly erased, replaced by someone fragile, someone unreliable. No one questioned it. Not even me, at least not out loud. That night, after everyone had left and the house returned to its new kind of quiet, I sat at the small desk in my room. I opened an old notebook I had not used in years. It was something I used to keep during my teaching days, a habit of recording details, observations, things that mattered. I wrote down what had happened. Not in anger, not as an accusation, but as a record. I told myself I was only being careful, that it was good to keep track of things, that I was not imagining the changes, but simply noticing them more clearly. Still, as I closed the notebook, I realized something I could not quite put into words. For the first time, I was no longer entirely certain of my place in my own home. If you're still watching and you can sense the subtle shift turning into something deeper, comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to the moment everything starts to change. By the time the guests arrived that evening, the house no longer felt like mine in any recognizable way. Evelyn had arranged everything with a precision that left no room for input. The table was set differently than I would have done it, with minimalist plates and tall glasses that looked more decorative than functional. Even the lighting had been adjusted, softer and dimmer, casting shadows that made the space feel unfamiliar. I moved quietly through the kitchen, offering help where I could, though it was clear I was not needed. Evelyn directed everything with ease, her voice confident, her movements efficient. Daniel handled the drinks, greeting each guest with a practiced charm that seemed effortless. I stood beside them at times, then stepped back when conversation flowed past me without pause. The guests were people from their world. Conversations turned quickly to business, investments, and real estate opportunities. Numbers were exchanged as casually as opinions, and laughter followed discussions I could not fully follow. I sat at the table, listening, nodding when appropriate, my presence acknowledged but not engaged. There was a time when this dining room belonged to me in a different sense. I had hosted dinners here, planned meals, guided conversations that made everyone feel included. Now, I felt like a visitor, carefully occupying a seat that no longer carried the same meaning. At some point, the conversation shifted toward property values and mortgages. One of the guests mentioned rising interest rates, and Daniel responded with a detailed explanation that drew admiration from the table. Evelyn smiled beside him, clearly proud. Then, without warning, she turned toward me. "Mom, you really should think about paying off the mortgage already." Her voice was light, almost casual, but loud enough to carry across the table. The effect was immediate. Conversation paused, just for a moment, long enough for the words to settle. A few of the guests exchanged glances. Someone let out a small, polite laugh, as if unsure how else to respond. The moment passed quickly on the surface, but something beneath it lingered. I felt the words land with a clarity that cut through everything else. The mortgage had been paid off 8 years ago. I had made the final payment myself, sitting at this very table with my husband beside me. We had celebrated quietly, knowing what it meant to finally own something outright after years of effort. I looked at Evelyn. Her expression had not changed. She reached for her glass, as if nothing unusual had been said. Daniel avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his plate. That was when the confusion gave way to something sharper. This was not a mistake. I felt a brief urge to correct her, to say the truth out loud, and restore what had just been taken from me in that single sentence. But the room was already moving on. The conversation resumed, the rhythm restored, as if my response was not required. So I smiled. I gave a small nod, the kind that suggests agreement without commitment. It was a gesture I had used many times before, one that allowed me to remain part of the moment without disrupting it. Inside, however, something shifted in a way I could not ignore. This was different from the small changes, the rearranged furniture, the open mail. This was not quiet or gradual. It was deliberate, placed in front of others as a fact. I sat through the rest of the evening in silence, listening but no longer truly present. Every word seemed distant, every laugh slightly out of reach. When the guests finally left and the house returned to stillness, I remained at the table for a long time. I thought about the notebook in my room, about the entries I had made, each one small on its own. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see the pattern clearly. This was not care. This was not misunderstanding. This was control. If you're still watching and that dinner scene made you feel the tension, comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what she decides to do next. The morning after the dinner felt heavier than usual, as if the air inside the house had thickened overnight. I woke earlier than I needed to, unable to return to sleep once my eyes opened. Evelyn's voice from the night before repeated itself in my mind with unsettling clarity. The words had been simple, almost careless, yet they lingered with a weight I could not ignore. I moved through the house quietly, careful not to disturb the routine that now seemed to belong entirely to Evelyn and Daniel. The kitchen was already arranged in their order, every object placed with intention that no longer included me. I made my coffee, stood for a moment by the window, and realized I was no longer trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Instead, I began to think. The open mail, the missing documents, the casual remark about my finances, all of it began to connect in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. I had spent months, perhaps years, explaining these things away. That morning, I stopped. By mid-morning, I had made a decision. I needed to see the truth for myself without relying on what I had been told. I drove into town, the familiar streets of Santa Fe offering a strange kind of comfort. The bank building stood as it always had, solid and orderly, a place where systems functioned as expected. Inside, everything felt structured, predictable. It was a sharp contrast to the quiet uncertainty that had taken root in my home. I approached the counter and asked to review my account history. My voice was steady, though I felt something tense beneath the surface. The clerk recognized me, greeted me politely, and guided me through the process without hesitation. As I sat at a small desk reviewing the records, I began to notice details that unsettled me. There were access times I did not remember, logins that did not match my usual habits. Nothing was missing, nothing overtly wrong, but the pattern was clear enough to raise questions. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, letting the realization settle. Daniel had been more involved than he had ever stated. The idea did not arrive with panic. It came slowly, like a door opening just enough to let in a cold draft. This was not help. It was access, and access, once given, can easily become control. I left the bank with a calm expression, but my thoughts had shifted into something more focused. I did not return home immediately. Instead, I drove to a small cafe on the edge of town, one I had visited years ago but rarely since. That was where I met Thomas Reed, a lawyer I had known through the school district. He had handled legal matters for several colleagues over the years, and I remembered him as someone careful and precise. We spoke quietly over coffee. I explained everything as clearly as I could, from the small changes in the house to the incident at dinner and what I had just discovered at the bank. He listened without interruption, his attention fixed, his questions measured. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and studied me for a moment. "Are you certain you are the only one with legal authority over your assets?" he asked. The question stayed with me longer than anything else we discussed. I realized, in that moment, how much I had assumed rather than confirmed. When I left the cafe, I did not feel afraid. I felt something steadier, something more defined. For the first time since all of this began, I understood that waiting and hoping would not change anything. If I wanted to regain control of my life, I would have to act. If you're still watching and you're realizing this is no longer just discomfort, but something much bigger, comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to the point where there's no turning back. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same, yet it felt entirely different. For years, I had walked through these rooms guided by memory and habit, seeing only what they had once been. Now, I saw them as they were. The living room was no longer arranged the way my husband and I had intended. The furniture reflected someone else's taste. The kitchen no longer carried the rhythm of my routines. Even the light that entered through the windows seemed altered, as though the house itself had adjusted to a new center that was not me. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, taking it all in without trying to correct it. Later that evening, I overheard Evelyn and Daniel talking in the living room. Their voices were low, but not enough to keep me from understanding the direction of the conversation. They were discussing renovation ideas, speaking about the house as if it were an opportunity waiting to be expanded. Daniel mentioned short-term rentals and market demand. Evelyn talked about updating the exterior to attract higher-paying guests. They spoke with a confidence that did not include me, as though decisions had already been made. I remained in the hallway, listening quietly. There was no anger in what I felt, not in the way I might have expected. Instead, there was a clarity that settled over me, steady and undeniable. They were planning a future that assumed ownership, not formally, not legally, but in every practical sense that mattered to them. And I had allowed that assumption to grow. That night, I sat in my room and considered what the house meant to me now. It was still filled with memories, still held the presence of a life I had shared with my husband. But it was no longer a place where I felt secure. It had become something else, something that could be taken piece by piece without my consent. The next morning, I made another decision. I contacted a real estate office that operated independently from any firm Daniel might know. I chose carefully, making sure there would be no connection that could lead information back to him. The woman who answered the phone spoke professionally, her tone efficient and clear. We arranged a meeting for later that day. The office was small but well kept, with large windows that let in the bright New Mexico light. I sat across from the agent and described the property in detail: 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, a large lot, original adobe structure with renovations done over the years. As I spoke, I realized how thoroughly I knew every part of the house. When she told me the estimated value, I felt a brief pause in my thoughts. The number was higher than I had expected. She explained the demand in Santa Fe, the appeal of the location, the uniqueness of older homes like mine. It was, in her words, a highly desirable property. I listened carefully, asking questions where necessary, but my mind was already moving ahead. This was not just a house filled with memories. It was an asset, one that could still be used to shape my future. I asked about confidentiality. She assured me that we could proceed discreetly, limiting exposure and arranging private showings with verified buyers. That was exactly what I needed. Before I left, I signed the initial agreement. It was a simple act, just ink on paper, but it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. I was not reacting anymore. I was acting. That evening, I returned home and moved through the rooms once more. The walls, the furniture, the quiet corners all seemed unchanged, yet I understood something I had not allowed myself to admit before. I had already crossed a line. There was no going back to what this house had once been. In the days that followed, I lived 2 lives at once. Outwardly, nothing changed. I moved through the house as I always had, quiet, unobtrusive, careful not to disrupt the rhythm Evelyn and Daniel had established. I made my coffee in the mornings, sat in my small room in the afternoons, and joined them for dinner when expected. If they noticed anything different about me, they did not say it. Inside, however, everything had shifted. I was waiting. The real estate agent called 2 days after we signed the agreement. She had a couple interested in seeing the house privately. They were serious buyers, she said, people who appreciated older homes and understood their value. We arranged a time when Evelyn and Daniel would both be out. On the morning of the showing, I prepared the house with a care that felt both familiar and distant. I straightened surfaces, opened curtains, and let the light fill the rooms. I did not try to restore the house to what it had once been. I simply made sure it was presentable, neutral, ready to be seen. When the couple arrived, I greeted them at the door. They were older, perhaps not far from my own age. There was something steady about them, something unhurried. They moved through the house slowly, taking in details that others might overlook. The woman paused near the window in the living room, running her hand lightly along the frame. The man asked thoughtful questions about the structure, the history, the land. For a moment, I saw something reflected back at me. A version of myself from years ago. A life that had begun in these very rooms, full of intention and quiet hope. It would have been easy to stop there, to hold on to that image and reconsider everything. But as I stood there, listening to them speak, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The memories were not the house. They had never been confined to walls or floors or windows. What I had built with my husband existed within me, not around me. And whatever this house had once been, it no longer held the same meaning. By the time they left, I had already made my decision. The offer came quickly, stronger than I had expected, with minimal conditions and a timeline that moved everything forward without delay. I reviewed the documents carefully, asked the questions I needed to ask, and then I accepted. There was no hesitation left. That evening, I prepared dinner as usual. Evelyn and Daniel sat across from me, talking about their day, about plans that extended into a future they assumed was still theirs to shape. I listened, nodding when appropriate, waiting for the moment I had already chosen. When it came, I reached into my bag and placed the folded contract on the table between us. "The house is already sold," I said. The words settled into the room with a stillness that felt almost physical. Evelyn stared at me, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Daniel reached for the paper, his movement slower, more deliberate. Neither of them spoke immediately, as if the meaning had not yet fully reached them. Then Evelyn's voice broke through, sharp and unsteady. She said I could not do this, that I had no right to make such a decision alone. There was something else beneath her anger, something closer to fear. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply remained where I was, steady and certain, because in that moment, more than any other, I understood what I had chosen, not the house, myself. If you're still watching and you can feel that everything has just shifted completely, comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to Chapter 7, where the consequences begin. The silence that followed that dinner was unlike anything I had experienced in the house before. It was not the quiet of early mornings or the stillness that came after my husband passed. This was something sharper, something fractured. It settled into the walls and lingered in every room, making even the smallest sound feel out of place. Evelyn did not speak to me that night after the initial confrontation. She moved through the house with quick, restless energy, opening and closing doors with more force than necessary. I could hear her voice from the other room, raised and uneven, as she spoke to Daniel. I did not try to follow every word. I did not need to. The meaning was already clear. Daniel, on the other hand, became quieter than I had ever seen him. He did not argue loudly or make sudden movements. Instead, he withdrew into a kind of focused silence, his attention shifting toward something more practical. When he passed me in the hallway, he gave a small nod, nothing more. By the next morning, the tension had settled into something colder. Evelyn confronted me again in the kitchen. Her voice carried the sharp edge of disbelief, as if repeating the situation might somehow change it. She said I had acted behind their backs, that I had betrayed them. There was an intensity in her words that might have shaken me before. Now, it did not. She went further, suggesting that I was not thinking clearly, that no reasonable person would make such a decision alone. The implication was unmistakable. It was the same idea she had planted in front of her friends, now spoken without restraint. I listened without interrupting. There was pain in hearing those words, but it did not overwhelm me. It moved through me and settled somewhere deeper, where it could no longer control my reactions. Later that afternoon, the real estate agent called. Her tone was careful, measured. Evelyn had gone to the office, demanding that the sale be canceled, insisting that I was not capable of making such decisions on my own. There had been talk of legal action, of questioning my mental state. I thanked the agent for informing me and assured her that everything had been done properly. The documents were signed, the process was moving forward, and there was no basis for interference. When I hung up the phone, I felt a clarity that surprised me. For years, I had adjusted myself to maintain peace, had accepted discomfort to preserve the idea of family. Now, that idea had been placed under a light I could not ignore. This was not care, it was control. In the days that followed, the house became a place of careful avoidance. Conversations were reduced to necessities. Meals were quiet, functional. Evelyn's anger did not disappear, but it changed shape, becoming something colder, more contained. Daniel began making calls, searching for a new place to live, his focus shifting entirely toward logistics. I watched them both with a distance I had never allowed myself before. There was grief in that distance, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost, not just the relationship as it was, but the belief that it could return to something familiar. That evening I sat alone in my room, the small space that had once felt like an afterthought. I looked around at the few things that remained mine, the objects that had not been replaced or moved. For the first time, I did not feel pushed into a corner. I felt separated, and in that separation, there was something steady, something final. I was no longer holding on to what this family used to be. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its steadiness. The tension in the house had not disappeared, but it had lost its sharp edges. What remained was distance. We moved around one another carefully, speaking only when necessary, each of us focused on separate paths that no longer overlapped. Evelyn and Daniel spent most of their time outside, meeting with agents, visiting properties, making calls that stretched late into the evening. Their conversations, when I overheard them, were no longer about plans for this house, but about where they would go next. The certainty they once carried had been replaced by urgency. I too began preparing for what would come after. I searched quietly, taking my time, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain that what I chose would truly belong to me. I found a small house near the center of Santa Fe, tucked into a quiet street lined with trees that offered shade even in the dry heat. It was modest, far smaller than the home I had lived in for decades, but it had something I had not felt in a long time. Stillness. When I walked through it for the first time, I did not think about what it lacked. I noticed instead how easily I could imagine myself there, moving freely, arranging things without explanation or permission. It was not filled with memories yet. and that absence felt like a kind of relief rather than loss. I made my decision quickly. The paperwork was simple. The commitment felt clear. For the first time in years, I was choosing a space that answered only to me. That evening, Evelyn approached me in the living room. Her expression was different, softer, though there was something uncertain beneath it. She sat across from me and spoke in a tone I had not heard in a long time, one that carried a trace of the daughter I once knew. She said that perhaps things had gone too far, that maybe they had not always treated me as they should have. She spoke about starting over, about finding a way to rebuild what had been strained. I listened. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the possibility she was offering, not because I believed it fully, but because I remembered what it had once been like to trust her without question. Then she mentioned the house. The suggestion came gently at first, almost as an afterthought. Perhaps, she said, there might still be a way to stop the sale. Perhaps we could reconsider, find a better solution together. The shift was immediate. I understood then that the foundation of her apology had not changed. The house remained at the center of everything. I responded calmly, without raising my voice, and told her that the decision had already been made, that it would not be reversed. Her expression tightened, the softness fading as quickly as it had appeared. Frustration returned, though quieter than before, as if even her anger had grown tired. Later that night, I came across a detail I had not known before. Through a passing remark and a fragment of a conversation, I learned that Evelyn had made a series of financial decisions that had not gone as planned. There were debts, obligations that had grown beyond her control. The realization settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This had never been about taking care of me. It had been about survival, about using what I had built to repair what she had lost. I sat alone in my room afterward, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. For the first time, everything made sense. If you're still watching and you're starting to see the truth behind everything, comment number 8 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to the final outcome of this story. The final days in this house passed with a quietness that felt almost unreal. The tension that had once filled every room had faded, replaced by a kind of stillness that came with inevitability. Boxes appeared in corners, then multiplied, gradually taking over the spaces that had once been full of furniture and routine. I packed slowly, without urgency. There was no need to take everything. In fact, I found that I did not want to. Many of the objects around me no longer held the same meaning they once had. I chose only what felt essential, what still belonged to me in a way that could not be replaced. Evelyn moved through the house differently during those days. I noticed how she paused in certain rooms, how her hand lingered on the edge of a table or the back of a chair. There was something softer in her movements, something reflective. At times, it seemed as if she were seeing the house not as a possession, but as a place filled with memories she had taken for granted. Daniel remained focused on the practical side of things. He coordinated the movers, checked schedules, confirmed details. His attention stayed on what needed to be done, not on what was being left behind. On the last evening, I walked through the house one final time. Each room held echoes of a life that had unfolded over decades. I remembered conversations, quiet mornings, the sound of laughter that once filled the space so easily. The memories came clearly, but they did not weigh on me as they might have before. They felt complete. Evelyn found me in the living room as I stood near the window. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said that she still could not believe it was all ending like this. There was a tremor in her voice, something closer to sadness than anger. She spoke about growing up in the house, about how every corner was connected to something she could not replace. She said it had always felt like home, something stable, something certain. I listened, then answered quietly. A home is not the walls that surround us. It is what we carry with us, whether we realize it or not. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the room as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. The next morning, everything moved quickly. The last boxes were carried out. The doors opened and closed for what would be the final time. When I stepped outside, I did not look back right away. When I finally did, the house stood exactly as it always had, but it no longer held me. I turned away and left. The first morning in my new home arrived without ceremony, yet it felt more significant than any moment I had experienced in years. The light came in gently through the windows, unfiltered by memories, untouched by the past. The space around me was quiet, not in the heavy way I had once known, but in a way that felt open and undemanding. I moved slowly through the rooms, learning them as if they were introducing themselves to me. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, everything simple and unfinished. There were no echoes here yet, no history layered into the corners. And for the first time, that absence did not feel like loss. It felt like possibility. I made my coffee and stood by the window, watching the street come to life in its own quiet rhythm. No one else moved through the house. No one rearranged what I had placed or spoke over my thoughts. The stillness belonged to me. In the days that followed, I began to build a routine again. Small things at first. A chair placed where I wanted it. A book set on a table without being moved. Each decision, no matter how minor, carried a sense of ownership I had not realized I was missing. As the rhythm of this new life settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me here. I thought about the years after my husband's death, about the silence that had made me vulnerable in ways I had not fully understood. I thought about how easily I had allowed others to step in, believing that their presence would fill what had been lost. But I also saw something else with clarity. I had chosen silence. I had avoided conflict, convinced myself that patience and understanding would preserve harmony. In doing so, I had allowed my boundaries to fade, little by little, until they were no longer visible to anyone, including myself. What happened was not sudden. It was gradual, built from moments I chose not to question. And yet, the end of that path had brought me here. I do not regret the decision I made, not the sale of the house, not the separation that followed. What I regret, if anything, is how long I waited to see what was happening. Family, I have learned, is not defined by proximity or shared space. It is defined by respect. Without that, what remains is not care, but control disguised as concern. I do not know what will become of my relationship with Evelyn. There are things that cannot be easily repaired, and perhaps they are not meant to be. What matters now is that I no longer measure myself through the expectations of others. This home, small and quiet as it is, holds something far greater than what I left behind. It holds my choices. And in that, I have found something I thought I had lost: myself. In the end, what we call home is never just a place. It is not made of walls, furniture, or the years we spend inside it. A true home is built on dignity, respect, and the quiet understanding that we are allowed to exist fully as ourselves. When those things begin to disappear, no matter how familiar the space may feel, it slowly stops being a place of belonging. Life has a way of testing our boundaries, especially when we are most vulnerable. Sometimes, the hardest lesson is not learning how to hold on, but knowing when to let go. Letting go is not defeat. It is clarity. It is the moment we choose peace over illusion, truth over comfort, and self-worth over silent endurance. Every ending carries within it the shape of a new beginning. And sometimes, the most powerful step forward is simply reclaiming the life that was always yours. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story resonated with you, I would truly appreciate your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.